you wake up in a jail cell with no memory of how you got there. The last thing you remember, you were somewhere else entirely. A different day, a different life. The guards tell you that you robbed a store at gunpoint. You have no idea what they're talking about. And you're about to learn something about yourself that will terrify the entire American legal system. This is the story of William Stanley Milligan, the first person in United States history to be found not guilty of a violent crime by reason of insanity, because the man who stood trial insisted he was not one man at all. He was 24. Columbus, Ohio, October 1977. 3 women, all students at Ohio State University, are abducted at gunpoint within days of each other. Each is driven to a secluded location. Each is raped. Each is threatened with death if she tells anyone. And each of them independently describes the same attacker, a man with pale eyes, a soft voice, and an unsettling calm that none of them can forget. Police move fast, composite sketches go out, and within weeks, they have a suspect, a 22-year-old drifter with a long juvenile record, already on parole for armed robbery. His name is Billy Milligan. When detectives bring him in, something is wrong. Not wrong in the way of a man protesting his innocence, wrong in a way none of them have ever seen. He answers to different names. His voice changes mid-sentence. One moment, he speaks with a thick, guttural Slavic accent, insisting his name is Rogan and that he is a communist. The next, he is a frightened 9-year-old girl named Christine drawing pictures on a napkin. Then he is a smooth, dangerous con man calling himself Alan, lighting a cigarette and asking for a lawyer like he's done this 100 times before. The detectives think he's performing. They think it's an act, a desperate criminal trying to dodge a life sentence. But then they call in psychiatrists. And the psychiatrists come back with something the courts have never had to reckon with before. Billy Milligan, they say, is not lying. He is not one person pretending to be many. He is, clinically, multiple people sharing one body, one bloodstream, one set of fingerprints. 10 of them at first. Eventually, the number will rise to 24. And here is the detail that will make headlines around the world. According to Milligan's own account and the psychiatric evaluations that follow, he was never conscious when the rapes occurred. Because the personality who committed the assaults was not Billy at all. Stay with this, because the story only gets stranger from here. To understand what happened in that courtroom, you have to go back before the crimes, back before the arrests, back to a childhood that the state of Ohio will eventually argue created 24 separate minds inside one body. Billy Milligan was born in Miami Beach, Florida in 1955. His biological father was a small-time entertainer who died by suicide when Billy was 3 years old, shooting himself in a car after his career collapsed. Billy's mother remarried a man named Chalmer Milligan, and the family relocated to a small farm in Lancaster, Ohio. According to sworn testimony later given in court testimony from Billy's mother, his sister, and Billy himself, Chalmer Milligan subjected young Billy to years of sustained physical and sexual abuse on that farm. Prosecutors and defense experts would later agree on very little in this case. But on this point, the evidence was overwhelming enough that even the state did not seriously contest it. According to the sworn testimony, the abuse on that farm was calculated, repeated, and designed to be undetectable. Chalmer Milligan reportedly buried Billy alive in a shallow grave in the fields, leaving only a thin air pipe above the soil, telling the boy that if he screamed, he would suffocate him for real. He would take Billy out to the barn, alone, away from the rest of the family, and threaten him with worse if he ever told his mother. To the outside world, the Milligans looked like an ordinary rural Ohio household. Behind the barn doors, a child was being systematically broken. The abuse, according to the psychiatrists who would later study him for hundreds of hours, is where it began. A child, repeatedly violated by someone who was supposed to protect him, with no way to fight back and no one to tell. The mind, faced with unbearable and repeated trauma it cannot escape physically, sometimes finds another way to escape. It splits the experience off. It assigns the pain to someone else, someone who isn't really him. A separate self is born to hold what the original child cannot survive holding. Imagine, for a moment, what that actually means for a 9-year-old boy. It means that somewhere inside him, A version of himself is created whose entire purpose is to be buried alive so the real Billy never has to remember it happening. Another is created to endure what happens in the barn. Layer by layer, assault by assault, the psychiatrist would later testify, an entire internal population was constructed not by choice but by necessity, the only defense mechanism available to a child with nowhere else to run. By the time Billy Milligan was an adult, the theory went this had happened again and again. Not two people, not three, an entire internal community, each one formed to handle a specific kind of danger. A frightened child, a protector who could take violence without flinching, a liar who could talk his way out of trouble. And this is the part that would put the case in headlines everywhere, at least one personality capable of extreme, uncontrolled violence. By the time detectives arrested him in 1977, Milligan already had a long juvenile and adult record, assault, robbery, a history bouncing between institutions. None of that had been enough to raise the question that was about to be asked in an Ohio courtroom for the first time. What happens when the law says a crime requires intent and the person accused genuinely does not remember committing it? The trial that followed would put not just Billy Milligan on trial, but the very idea of a single, unified self. When the case reached trial in December 1978, the defense's strategy was almost unheard of. They weren't arguing that Billy didn't do it. They were arguing that Billy, the core personality, the frightened child who had been asleep psychologically since that farm in Lancaster, never did anything at all. The defense called it dissociative identity disorder, though at the time the diagnosis was still widely known by an older name, multiple personality disorder. And to make their case, they didn't just put character witnesses on the stand. They brought in some of the most credentialed forensic psychiatrists in the country. People who had spent hundreds of hours interviewing Milligan, sometimes under hypnosis, and who each independently arrived at the same staggering conclusion. Milligan wasn't performing. According to these experts, distinct, measurable physiological changes occurred as different personalities took control. Different handwriting, different vocabularies, different accents, even documented differences in brainwave patterns, and, according to some reports, allergic reactions that varied from personality to personality. The prosecution fought back hard. Their own experts argued Milligan was a skilled manipulator exploiting a controversial and unproven diagnosis to escape accountability for a series of brutal rapes. They pointed to his long juvenile record, to the ease with which he'd already deceived institutions before, and they warned the jury directly, if you accept this defense, you are opening a door that can never be closed again. Legal scholars watching the case knew that if the jury accepted the defense's theory, it would set a precedent that terrified prosecutors nationwide, a precedent where a defendant could argue that a crime happened undeniably using his body and still be found not responsible for it. Inside the courtroom, jurors watched something that no legal proceeding in the country had ever put in front of 12 ordinary citizens before. They watched Milligan's demeanor shift, visibly, between testimony sessions. They watched a defendant who, by every account from the guards who transported him, could not simply turn it on for effect because the switches, according to those closest to the case, happened at moments that helped the prosecution as often as they helped the defense. Central to the defense's case was a personality named Dragan Vidaskovic, a self-declared communist, fluent in Serbo-Croatian, who described himself as the keeper of hate and claimed responsibility for violence, but denied ever committing rape, saying he found it disgusting. And then there was Adalana, a quiet, isolated, 19-year-old lesbian personality who, according to the defense's account, had emerged to seek the intimacy and affection Billy's core personality had never been allowed to have. It was Adalana, the defense argued, who had committed the assaults not out of violence, but out of a desperate, warped need for closeness, without Dragan's knowledge or consent, and entirely outside the awareness of the core personality named Billy. On December 4th, 1978, the jury returned its verdict, not guilty, by reason of insanity on all counts. It was the first time in American legal history that a defendant charged with a violent crime had been acquitted on the basis of a multiple personality diagnosis. Newspapers across the country ran the story on their front pages. And for Billy Milligan, the trial wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning of the next, stranger chapter. Being found not guilty by reason of insanity did not mean Billy Milligan walked free. Instead, he was committed to a series of Ohio mental institutions, beginning what would become nearly a decade under state psychiatric supervision, one of the strangest and most closely documented periods of institutional treatment in American history. Doctors at these facilities didn't just treat Milligan. They studied him exhaustively, trying to answer a question no one had rigorously answered before. Could 24 separate personalities inside one body be reintegrated into a single, stable self? Over the years of treatment, more personalities reportedly emerged until the total, according to Milligan's psychiatrists, reached 24. Among them, Arthur, a controlled English-accented personality who claimed to have taught himself to read Arabic and to have studied physics and biology, and who functioned as a kind of internal decision-maker, deciding which personality was allowed to hold the spot, meaning to be in conscious control of the body. There was Tommy, an escape artist and electronics expert, Danny, a young, terrified personality unable to look at adult men after the abuse he endured, and, according to the treatment team, one final personality who was never meant to take control at all, a personality the doctors referred to only as the teacher, who Milligan claimed held the memories of all 23 others, and who, over the course of treatment, worked to fuse them back into a single, unified identity. The treatment itself was unlike anything doctors had attempted before. Therapists would sit across from Milligan and, through hypnosis and long conversation, attempt to speak directly to each personality individually, negotiating with Reagan to set down his self-appointed role as protector, coaxing the childlike Danny into trusting adult men again, asking Arthur, the internal gatekeeper, to allow the spot to be held by personalities who had spent years never once being allowed into the light. It was, in effect, an attempt at group therapy conducted entirely within a single skull. Milligan's case attracted the attention of author Daniel Keyes, already famous for Flowers for Algernon, who spent years interviewing Milligan and the treatment team, and eventually published a book called The Minds of Billy Milligan, cementing the case in public consciousness, and, later, inspiring adaptations that Hollywood would spend decades trying and repeatedly failing to bring to the screen. By 1988, doctors declared Milligan's personalities successfully fused. He was released from institutional custody. And for the public that had followed his case for over a decade, one question remained unanswered. Was the man walking free in 1988 really cured, or had he simply learned, better than anyone the legal system had ever encountered, how to make people believe exactly what he needed them to believe? After his release, Billy Milligan largely disappeared from public life, living under different circumstances in California, reportedly under close monitoring for years by the state. He avoided the spotlight that had defined the previous decade of his life, giving few interviews and largely refusing to discuss the details of the case that had made him infamous. He died in December 2014 at the age of 59 from cancer in relative obscurity, a quiet ending for a case that had once occupied the front pages of newspapers across the country. But the questions his case raised never fully went away. Legal scholars still study his trial as the case that forced American courts to confront the limits of criminal responsibility. Psychiatrists remain divided, some treating his case as one of the most thoroughly documented instances of severe dissociative identity disorder on record. Others still arguing, decades later, that Milligan was simply the most convincing manipulator the criminal justice system had ever faced. And that is the question that has outlived every doctor, every juror, and every journalist who ever tried to answer it. Was Billy Milligan a victim of a childhood so brutal it fractured his mind into 24 separate people, protecting a broken child from a horror he could never have survived remembering? Or was he something far more calculating, a man who understood, better than anyone before him, exactly how to make a courtroom, a country, and generations of doctors after him believe whatever he needed them to believe? Nearly 50 years later, no one has ever definitively answered that question. And perhaps, in the end, that was always the most unsettling part of the story. Not that we don't know which personality committed those crimes in October of 1977, it's that we're still not entirely sure anyone ever really knew who Billy Milligan was at all.